So I think we can now move into the agenda, and the first panel, whose title is An Introduction, the Global Crisis of Religious Freedom through the Prism of Integral Human Development. Because we felt it was necessary to have an introductory settings, we have some outstanding keynote address to get the conversation starting. Perhaps I just take a couple of minutes to give a little bit of the idea of what the conference idea and objective are. The conference actually moves from the emerging recognition in the policy and scholarly communities that the relationship between freedom of religion or belief, the human rights enshrined in the Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and sustainable development has been overlooked. More precisely, what are increasingly presented as two global existential challenges. On one hand, the growing persecution and discrimination based on religion or belief, and on the other, the failure to achieve the 2030 Sustainable Development Goal agenda, concretely to stop poverty, for example, and the environmental degradation. We assume that these two challenges have quite a lot of interlocking dimensions. And the central question of the conference has been, how can we talk of leaving no one behind, the central promise of the 2030 SDG agenda, if we neglect all those who are marginalized, discriminated against, and persecuted owing to their very own belief. That was the starting point. But we also were very much inspired by what Pope Francis said in his historic 2015 United Nations address in the context of the adoption of the SDG agenda. And I quote here, "The simplest and best measure and indicator of the implementation of the new agenda for development will be effective, practical, and immediate access on the part of all to essential material and spiritual goods, housing, dignified and properly remunerated employment, adequate food and drinking water, religious freedom, and more generally, spiritual freedom and education." And then he concludes, "These pillars of integral human development have a common, which is the right to life and more generally what we could call the right to existence, to human nature itself." So the conference really wants to explore the proposition that the idea of integral human development, which is of course of Catholic provenance, but as we will show in this conference, find echo in many other religious, philosophical, and wisdom traditions, that this idea may help to explore the global crisis of freedom of religion or belief and the policy response to it in an innovative way, by taking into account the broader human development context, by engaging multi-faith perspectives on religious freedom and development, and finally, by drawing on the current uniqueness of Rome as a global hub of transnational network of religious connection. The goal, we hope, to be seen, is to create a religious-sensitive platform, global platform, for engaging religious and policy leaders globally on this topical agenda. And we couldn't have a better way to get our discussion going, but to have His Excellency, the Archbishop Paul Gallagher, the Secretary for the Relation with States and International Organization of the Holy See. We are very grateful that you find time in your very busy schedule to attend this event. Archbishop, His Excellency, the floor is yours.
Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I'd like to apologize for arriving late. I hope I haven't delayed the start of the conference too much. I would like to express my gratitude to the organizers of today's conference for extending an invitation to me to present the perspective of the Holy See on the promotion of religious freedom and integral human development. Okay. The Second Vatican Council committed the Catholic Church to the promotion of religious freedom. The Declaration, Dignitatis Humanae, explains the right of the person and of communities to social and civil freedom in religious matters. In order for this freedom, willed by God and inscribed in human nature, to be exercised, no obstacle should be placed in its way, since the truth cannot be imposed except by virtue of its own truth. The dignity of the person and the very nature of the quest for God require that all men and women should be free from every constraint in the area of religion. It is beyond doubt that the right of freedom, religious freedom, in both historical and logical terms, occupies the primacy among the rights of freedom. Historically, following the Protestant Reformation, which resulted in the dissolution of Europe's religious unity and the emergence of numerous sovereign states, confessionalism was regarded as a fundamental and irreplaceable element in maintaining the political community's cohesion. The principle, cuius regio, eius religio, was first sanctioned in 1555 by the Peace of Augsburg, and then confirmed in 1648 by the Peace of Westphalia. This principle came to consecrate the obligation of citizens to follow the religion of their sovereign, and it also came to legitimize the policy of repression of religious minorities by political power. Consequently, the assertion of the right to freedom of conscience was followed by claims to other freedoms. However, it can be argued that religious freedom also has a primogeniture in a logical sense. This is because, upon closer inspection, the rights of freedom that have been gradually consecrated in the transformations of states in a democratic sense are nothing but specifications of religious freedom, since it encompasses freedom of thought, freedom of association, freedom of assembly, and so on. Freedom of religion can be considered a prism through which all freedoms can be viewed. It might be said that there is a close connection between human rights and freedom of religion. While this is not the only aspect of human rights, it is arguably the most fundamental. It is the right to freedom of conscience that provides the foundation for all other human rights. By allowing individuals to exercise their conscience without interference, it places a limit on the authority of the state. This, in turn, ensures that fundamental rights are not violated. It is therefore clear that the violation of the right to religious freedom has the effect of undermining not just one right, but the entire category of human rights. It is important to note that despite the existence of precedents and primacies in this area, religious freedom in its individual, collective, and institutional dimensions is currently facing significant challenges. It is a matter of concern that, according to some estimates, almost 4.9 billion people live in countries with serious or very serious violations of religious freedom. At least 7 out of every 10 citizens in the world are currently prevented or harmed in the exercise of their rights in matters of conscience. It is noteworthy that Christians are the most vulnerable in this regard. Over 365 million Christians, approximately 1 in 7, face high levels of persecution for their faith. Attacks on churches and Christian properties have increased significantly in 2023, with more Christians than ever being reporting violent attacks. These figures are noteworthy, particularly when one considers that even a single violation of a human right is of an unprecedented gravity. It is thus worrying that the number of people persecuted on account of their religious beliefs is on the rise, in contrast to the general trend observed for other human rights violations. There are a number of factors contributing to the unexpected and significant increase in the number of intolerance, discrimination, or even persecution on the basis of the person's religious beliefs. First, religious fundamentalism, which is not limited to Islam. It is often mixed with forms of nationalism, which are gradually making explosive realities that were once immune to religious intolerance. The phenomenon does not only stem from public violence, from the non-democratic nature of the state system, but also from the growing violence of private groups expressing religious cultures and beliefs. These can also arise for political and economic reasons. In this sense, the violence to which Catholics, bishops, priests, lay people are subjected in various realities is unique, because the Church opposes the spread of an economy of plunder, which favors the widening gap between the few rich and the multitude of poor, and manipulates and destroys the environment. Another source is sovereignism, which is the name of preserving national identities, not infrequently leads to more or less explicit forms of intolerance towards religious minorities. This raises, among other things, the delicate question of the legitimate limits that are or can be placed on the exercise of a right that must be balanced with others in a democratic society. There is also an intolerance that shows its sinister face in the opulent countries of the Northern Hemisphere, in the West, which prides itself on its achievements in the recognition and protection of human rights. This is a paradoxical situation because, on the one hand, these countries pride themselves on being the exporters of human rights, sometimes even of what they erroneously call rights. Think of the struggles for the universalization of abortion as a right, or more generally, of so-called reproductive rights. Think also of the demands on the subject of gender. On the other hand, they neglect the first of the rights in question, religious freedom. This is often due to a clear ideological factor, namely the secularism of the state and public institutions, which is in fact based on secularism. Here, the neutrality of the public apparatus in relation to the free choice of citizens in religious matters is replaced by an ideology intolerant of other beliefs, which are consequently marginalized to the point of disappearing from the public agora. The absence of any reference to a religious freedom in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development is indicative of the reluctance of the international community to acknowledge the religious dimension in the lives of individuals. The document fails to address this issue in the context of development. In this document, religion is regarded as a mere attribute among the numerous characteristics that define the human person. However, as Pope Francis said, that the simplest and best measure and indicator of the implementation of the new agenda for development will be effective, practical, and immediate access on the part of all to essential material and spiritual goods, housing, dignified and properly remunerated employment, adequate food and drinking water, religious freedom, and more generally, spiritual freedom and education, as was quoted earlier. The 2030 Agenda is somehow incomplete because it addresses only part of human flourishing, leaving out the spiritual dimension. Indeed, development, as Pope Paul VI wrote, cannot be limited to mere economic growth. In order to be authentic, it must be integral. That is, it has to promote the good of every man and of the whole man. End of quotation. It is clear then that integral human development is a process by which the individual attains well-being while contributing to the common good. It is a long-term, dynamic process based on human dignity and the right relationships. This includes each person's relationship with God, self, others, and the whole of creation. Advancing integral human development means working with a variety of actors to transform the way societies live, heal, and structure their relationships. The advancement of integral human development depends on the active engagement of individuals within a just and peaceful society that respects the sacredness of life and the dignity of every person. Religious freedom plays a decisive role in achieving integral human development. Indeed, religious freedom, founded on the dignity of the human person and on the Christological revelation, does not do anything other than provide the matrix of an idea that modernity has defended vigorously. It must be clear, however, that religious freedom is a question of natural law, on which any theological reflection is based, and that both lead to an anthropological understanding of the question at hand. It is evident that the relationship between religion and society is undergoing a significant transformation. On the one hand, the religious dimension of the human experience has been marginalized. On the other hand, forms of fundamentalism are gaining traction, advocating for the re-emergence of religion in the public sphere, sometimes with elements of fanaticism. In this context, there is a pressing need for an anthropological and political integration between the individual and the collective dimensions of religious freedom. It is, however, necessary to point out that on the one hand, the absolute ethical religious indifference of the state has the effect of weakening civil society, and on the other hand, there is a risk of regression of law into a theocratic one. The state is not merely the mere guarantor of subjective desires, nor an indifferent and neutral observer of people's free behavior in the context of social life. In this second scenario, the state would paradoxically assume the form of a secularist imitation and of the theocratic conception of religion, which determines the orthodoxy and heresy of freedom in the name of political salvific vision of the ideal society. The absolutism and relativism of this liberal morality are in conflict with illiberal exclusionary effects in the public sphere, which are perceived to be the consequence of the state's pretended neutrality. The state should therefore exercise a detached neutrality and grant religious groups and all individuals an equal right to the public manifestation of their religious convictions. The aim of the state must always be to pursue the common good. This does not mean that the state is competent in religious matters, but rather that it recognizes and promotes the humanizing action of religious groups without undue interference in dogmatic or internal organizational matters. At the foundation of religious freedom is the capacity of the human person to realize themselves in their relationship and with the spiritual authority. There must be an emphasis on conscience, which every person has a duty to follow. Conversely, no one can force a person to act against their conscience, especially in religious matters. Civil authorities have the obligation to respect and enforce this fundamental right within the just limits of the common good. This demonstrates that religious freedom is not to be equated with the arbitrariness of a conscience devoid of an objective and transcendent reference. The issue is not merely a matter of legal interpretation, rather it concerns the truth of the human person, which the Church believes it can safeguard as a precious gift received in revelation. Furthermore, this is not to be understood as an attempt to impose said truth on all, but rather as an endeavor to demonstrate it. The defense of religious freedom can be understood as the defense of the truth of the human person in the face of constraints that might be imposed by fundamentalist religious groups or totalitarian states, as well as neutrality of the state that is understood as indifference to the contribution that religious persons or groups can make to the construction of social life. Those who are able to enjoy religious freedom will also be able to achieve their own integral development and will be agents of development in the wider society. And I thank you for your kind attention.
Excellency. Thank you very much, Your Excellency. That was a very good way of start thinking about this issue. When we start designing conference, we were aware that in the room we will have probably two constituencies. One who has been working and also practically engaging with the promotion of religious freedom, the freedom of religion or belief. On the other hand, we will have the people who have been engaged with the SDG agenda, as well as in particular working from the integral human development perspective. We knew that we had to do some bridging the gap. There was the need for some. So we just looked for the two best great international experts who could tell us about what is integral human development. And so we were very lucky to find our friend Scott Appleby from Notre University. And the same thing we wanted on international religious freedom and the link with integral human development, and Professor Silvio Ferrari. Both have been part of this academic committee that have been shaping this initiative. So Scott Appleby, the Dean of the Keough School of Global Affairs at Notre Dame University, and I want to say in his last year he spent all his life in setting a new school which is inspired by this idea of integral human development. Thank you, Scott. The floor is yours.
Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to be with you at this event. To frame my presentation, I offer the following working definition. Integral human development describes the state of a society in which the irreducible dignity of each person and of every person, and the cultural and spiritual, as well as economic and material requirements of human flourishing, are central to political and social life and upheld by the rule of law. The provenance of the term integral human development, which at the Keough School we just refer to as IHD, so I'll refer to as IHD. The provenance of IHD comes from Louis-Joseph Lebray, 1897 and 1966, a French-Dominican social scientist, philosopher, and pioneer of development ethics, who sought to, quote, put the economy at the service of man. After completing his theological studies in 1929, Lebray was assigned to the French port town of St. Malo, where he observed the destitution of the fishermen and their families. He conducted in-depth surveys among the fishermen regarding their problems and needs in an effort to find solutions. For 10 years, in areas as diverse as Britain, the Baltic, and the Mediterranean, he studied connections between unemployment, low wages, the poorly organized local fishing industry, and the attempt on the part of international firms to monopolize the best fishing areas. Lebray determined that ingrained structural causes doomed small-scale local fishermen in the broader market. At the same time, he established trade unions, co-ops, and maritime associations to reconfigure the way business was done. In 1942, skipping over some important decades, but he created the review Economia Humanisme, which became the vehicle for disseminating his ideas. A lecture trip to Brazil in 1947 led Lebray to focus on development in the Third World, as it was called then. He worked in Brazil, Colombia, Senegal, and Lebanon over the course of 15 years, and other countries. And he concluded that chronic structural evils cannot be corrected by subjective goodwill, but by systematic transformation of those structures, which presupposes a thorough understanding of how they work. He believed in the necessity of combining research and rigorous analysis with action. He was recognized by the United Nations as an expert on the question of living standard disparities in the world. Today, we take many of his insights for granted, but they were somewhat novel at the time. Within the church, Lebray advocated for an increased solidarity with poor countries. Pope Paul VI appointed him a consultant at Vatican II, and Lebray contributed to the drafting of Gaudium et Spes. He represented the Holy See at the first United Nations Conference for Trade and Development in 1965. Perhaps most significantly, Lebray drafted key sections of Pope Paul VI in 1967 encyclical Populorum Progressio on the development of peoples, which put forward the concept of integral human development, as Archbishop Gallagher indicated. Lebray was influenced by and influenced many of his contemporaries, not least Jacques Maritain and his concept of integral humanism. One of Lebray's disciples, Denis Goulet, who I was pleased to have as a colleague, summarized a core element of IHD, integral human development. Quote, societies are more human or more developed, not when men and women have more, but when they are able to be more. I provided these historical details, however sketchy, to underscore the fact that IHD has its origins in a particular religious community and tradition, Roman Catholicism, with its own specific convictions about the human person. That is, its own specific cultural and theological anthropology, according to which every person, in line with his or her divinely bestowed dignity, an inherent defining quality which the state cannot grant or take away, every person is called to flourishing and self-actualization within a transnational community of common purpose. This historical and enduring specificity of origin and sources of integral human development raises the question of whether IHD is sufficiently open to epistemological and philosophical pluralism, whether it can become a trusted, empowering framework within which an overlapping consensus about the centrality of the right to religious freedom can be advanced. Each pope, from Paul VI to Francis perhaps most emphatically, has invoked integral human development as a guiding principle and arguably as the interpretive key to the rich 133-year-old tradition of Catholic social thought and action. And each of the popes, John Paul II and Francis most emphatically, has presented IHD as a second-order bridging discourse open to and welcoming engagement with other religious traditions, wisdom traditions, and humanist and philosophical traditions. Indeed, there is a recognition that IHD cannot evolve, as it must, as a compelling insight into human nature and human society without this global engagement from many different sources. Quick commercial, the Ansari Institute for Global Engagement with Religion within the Keough School at Notre Dame is dedicated to contributing to the evolution and refinement of IHD by convening religious actors from multiple traditions to explore the concept and present their own teachings and practices that resonate with the concept of human dignity and its relationship to human freedom. The potential for an effective universalism is real, or so Catholic proponents of IHD believe, while striving to avoid any odor of moral superiority or trace of cultural or religious arrogance or imperialism. Indeed, by embracing an understanding of development and freedom based on human dignity and the common good, Lebray himself intended to offer a vision of human growth and social change that speaks to people from many different moral and religious traditions. This horizon that transcends the Catholic and Christian context is also noticeable in the sources Lebray used in his writings and his speeches. Even though his central inspiration remained Catholic, he made use of ideas from various sources, including existentialist philosophy and the writings of Mahatma Gandhi and Rabindranath Tagore. How does the concept of IHD view the human person in her innate freedom? According to my colleague Clemens Sedmak, in his pivotal groundbreaking book, Enacting Integral Human Development, which came out just a few months ago, proponents of IHD invite an understanding of the human person beyond any of the roles she may inhabit. A patient in the hospital is so much more than a patient. An incarcerated person is so much more than a prisoner. A refugee is so much more than a refugee. A person living in poverty is so much more than a poor person. IHD is more than an idea or concept, however. It is an invitation to and a platform for moral discernment and ethically informed action. IHD calls, indeed, for an ongoing assessment of social situations and structures in the spirit of Lebray. It is incompatible with a view of the human person as an unencumbered self, someone living in isolation from community and from responsibilities to others. And it considers the person as a relational being with a history and a multidimensional existence. Well, this is all well and good, but the question remains, what does IHD add to the efforts since the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the efforts to avoid a kind of overlapping consensus, and to the question of today's conference, what has IHD to do with, quote, the global crisis of religious freedom, which we've heard about? My colleague Silvio Ferrari will argue persuasively, in my view, that the relevant question is the following: is the right to religious freedom, as it is regulated today in the laws of our countries and in international conventions, still adequate to the needs of contemporary society? Silvio, as you will shortly hear, will elaborate his own answers to these questions. Mine is a no. The legal regime supporting the right to religious freedom, while essential, is not as determinative or decisive in the adjudication, enforcement, and extension of human rights, including the right to integral human development, as it could be, precisely because it is not sufficiently grounded in a multidisciplinary, multicultural, humanist, and religiously informed vision of the human person as a spiritual as well as a political rights-bearing actor. IHD offers such a moral ground and framework which is capable, through a disciplined process of dialogue and cross-cultural collaboration across traditions, of achieving an overlapping consensus among growing numbers of religious and secular communities and institutions. Consider how IHD promises to add a recognizable but still new depth dimension to the campaign for and defense of the right to religious freedom and to the bolstering of other human rights. So I'm going to quickly list some of the dimensions of IHD, which time does not permit me to elaborate, but consider how this configuration of characteristics of this concept and practice can contribute to the bolstering of the right to religious freedom. The central role of human dignity, a relational understanding of the human person and of human freedom, a moral understanding of development itself, the recognition of material needs and realities amidst inequalities of opportunity, the consideration of cultural richness, beauty, and the moral imagination of particular peoples and societies, the importance of the non-productive aspects of human life, special consideration for the most disadvantaged and those left behind, a recognition of interconnectedness and integral ecology, a sense of the relevance of first and last questions: where do we come from, where are we destined, the understanding of human flourishing as the growing realization of one's potential, to the realization, that is, of a kind of fullness of life as a person free to determine one's own fundamental beliefs. All of these and other dimensions of a rich concept of IHD, of integral human development, have much to contribute to the still evolving regime of the right to religious freedom. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Scott. I think that's very important for us to understand some of the main ideas around this concept. And now I'll ask Professor Silvio Ferrari, which is Emeritus Professor of Religion and Law at the University of Milan, and also the Honorary President of the Consortium on the Studies of Religion and Law. And he has been a teacher for generations of Italian scholars, and I would say beyond Italian frontiers, of people who had an interest in religious freedom, and we are very grateful that you have helped us shaping the concept of this conference. Silvio, the floor is yours.
Well, good morning to everybody, and thank you to the Atlantic Council and the Order of Malta for convening, and the other sponsors for convening this conference. Let me start with a question. Are we really sure to be in the middle of a global crisis of religious freedom, as affirmed in the concept paper of this conference? My answer is yes, but it is not something new. A little more than 100 years ago, thousands of Jews were being killed in Eastern and Central European pogroms. 50 years ago, half of Europe was under the domination of a regime that oppressed all religions. And if we look to other continents, the situation was not much better. I wonder whether in the past there was more religious freedom than today. So why do we all talk about freedom of religion as a right in danger, as a right under attack? Mainly, I think, because expectations and therefore perceptions have changed. What was accepted in the past is no more acceptable today, and let me add, fortunately. We live in the age of rights, and we demand more from the right to religious freedom than just a defense against persecution and discrimination. Therefore, we should address a different question, the one that was already mentioned by Scott. Is the right to religious freedom, as we find it regulated in our domestic laws and in international law, is this right adequate, up to the task, up to the needs of contemporary society? And here again, my answer would be yes, but only in part. It is not enough to focus on restriction of religious freedom and to fight persecution, social hostility, and hate speech against religion. All this is absolutely necessary. But if we stop here, we remain prisoners without, maybe without fully realizing it. We remain prisoners of an excessively defensive conception of freedom of religion. And I think that looking at freedom of religion through the lens of IHD can help us to overcome this too narrow approach. IHD provides an horizon at the center of which is human dignity. And in this context, freedom of religion is simply a tool, indispensable, but not an end in itself. Even if we were able to ensure freedom of religion fully to everybody, a question would remain: freedom for what? And the capability approach to development answers, and I quote here Amartya Sen, that freedom is not only the principal means of development, but also its primary end. While the IHD approach accepts the first answer, but not the second. From its point of view, the primary end of development is not freedom, but it is ensuring human dignity for all. And this approach has a significant impact on the way we conceive freedom of religion. Because living with dignity requires something more than the freedom from persecution, discrimination, etc. It requires the freedom to give a contribution to the shaping of the common good through life experiments and projects of living together that embody the religious worldview of an individual or a community. This positive conception of religious freedom makes it possible for individual and collective religious identities to become a social resource. And in this sense, I think it is true that a society that promotes freedom of religion has the potential to develop in a more enriching way than a society that does not respect this right, because the first society can make use of resources that are precluded to the second. However, I think that we need to take great care to correctly interpret the link, the relation between freedom of religion and development, because we know that there are countries with little or no freedom of religion that have had a strong economic development, that have been able to develop welfare, health, school systems that have reduced poverty, mortality, and illiteracy. And this type of development can even be sustainable in the sense that it can be consistent with the future needs as well as the current ones. But the question is, is possible to have true development without freedom of religion, freedom of expression, freedom of association, and so on? The answer of the IHD approach is no, because true development requires broadening the perspective from material to immaterial goods, and introducing, alongside the scientific, technological, economic dimensions of development, the cultural, spiritual, and religious ones that are essential for the human scale development, or, to be more precise, for a development on the scale of human dignity. So this is, in my opinion, the first contribution that IHD can give to a reconceptualization of the right to freedom of religion. However, this holistic conception of development is only half of the picture. Up to now, basically, I have said one thing. I have underlined that IHD broadens the understanding of development to encompass, around the notion of human dignity, profiles of human life that had hitherto been neglected when speaking of development. a broadening of the horizon. Now I would like to highlight the other principle on which IHD is grounded, the awareness. And here I quoted the encyclical Laudato Si, the awareness that the notion of development cannot be imposed from outside, but must be understood within the world of symbols and customs proper to each human group. And this caveat applies not only to the notion of development, but also to each of its components. Therefore, when we affirm that the religious dimension is a component of IHD, we should take into account that also all human beings share a religious dimension of their life. This dimension manifests itself in many different forms, according to the historical, social, and cultural context where it has taken shape. In this sense, IHD is inherently plural, because it includes different expressions of the religious profile of human life. And again, this second characteristic of IHD has relevant consequences for religious freedom, because it helps us to understand that the right to religious freedom is not a right without history or context. Starting from a universal basis and answering to a universal need, this right develops according to times, forms, and ways that arise from and are deeply rooted in particular cultures. And this is the reason why freedom of religion cannot be exported from one country to another, as in recent years many have tried to do, always unsuccessfully. Technology, science, wealth that are at the base of the economic development can be exported. But freedom of religion can only be cultivated starting from the different seeds that every culture and civilization provides. In conclusion, IHD provides freedom of religion with a framework oriented towards the development of human dignity, and this suggests to consider more carefully the promotional profiles, freedom to and not only freedom from, and the contextual roots of the right to religious freedom, which can be cultivated but cannot be exported. These indications lead me to reflect in more general terms on the tools we use to measure both development and freedom of religion. We have learned that measuring development on the basis of economic indicators alone is not methodologically correct. Are we sure that measuring religious freedom on the basis of indicators that primarily consider its violations gives a correct picture of what we are measuring? I am not saying that a quantitative analysis of the legal restriction and the social hostilities surrounding the right to religious freedom is useless. But I wonder if these indicators should be complemented by others that, on the one hand, consider the forms of promotion of religious freedom, and on the other hand, consider also better integrate the weight of particular traditions in the measurement of this universal right, which is freedom of religion. All this integration, this complement, in my opinion, would provide a more nuanced and closer to reality picture of the global crisis of religious freedom mentioned in the title of this panel. Thank you.
I think we have now some initial material to start our conversation. We have a half an hour and to open the conversation, but Your Excellency, you have given more than simply the official position of the Holy See on the promotion of religious freedom and integral human development, which we could say in ministerial governmental way belongs also to two different dicastery of the Holy See government. But I will get back briefly to you because I think both Scott, Appleby, and Silvio have start really to thinking about these mutual interlinkages of these two realities. Can you react perhaps to some of their insight? Do you think that this might pose some interesting new way of thinking in your work about promoting these two important aspects in the life of the Catholic Church and the Holy See? What do you think?
Well, yes, I would agree with you. I think that both what Scott and Silvio presented us with were a more philosophical reflections on the concepts that we're playing around with. And I think that is useful for us to take on board and to take notice of. Obviously, we possibly, to our disadvantage, have a tendency to do a sort of comparative documentary exercises in seeing how things develop over times in documents, official documents of the Holy See, of the popes, etc., in developing concepts and ideas. Maybe that there are, I was quite taken by the idea that we have to have a very much an interdisciplinary approach, drawing on many sources to enrich the concepts. One of the things that, as I was listening to Scott in particular, was coming to my mind was the fact that we possibly have a difficulty in communicating some of these ideas. They're rather sophisticated, rather thing, and development does tend to fall into the difficulty of a certain amount of jargon, sometimes not aided always by the UN use of language. Whereas I think that what was striking me all the time is that we were going around a concept that could be expressed as a certain degree of human flourishing, which in terms of the object of development, in which obviously the religious dimension, the spiritual dimension is extremely important, and one would say essential, that there should be that religious freedom dimension in anybody's personal, individual
human pilgrimage, if you like, which obviously they then feel it has its own dynamic, and which I would then suggest could be expressed in this not self-fulfillment in a sort of egotistical way, but rather a human flourishing in a very interior way. Thank you.
No, thank you, Archbishop Scott. Can I get back to you? Because I think sometimes, you had the same problem that Archbishop told about the United Nations might apply to some of the academic writing. This concept is too general, philosophical. Can you try to give me some concrete example of what difference actually makes to some concrete challenges to think through this prism of integral human development? Can you give me some concrete examples that have touched you as particularly powerful or relevant?
Yes. I'm going to take the occasion to say one thing to preface the example. And Archbishop Gallagher just called this thought to my mind. Of course, in this conference and most of the day, and certainly in this panel, we are speaking with a great deal of idealism and with a great deal of aspiration. Philosophically, theologically, we think, I would argue that what we're saying is ultimately pragmatic. But we also realize that, the first point, that some people working in development in this room and elsewhere would say, well, that's all well and good. I've got crises erupting every other neighborhood around the world. I have to feed people. We have healthcare needs. We don't have time to reflect upon these loftier aspirations. I can see that being a plausible kind of response to the people who are every day in the trenches and dealing with the consequences of war and disease and so forth. That leads me to amplify Silvio's very important concluding remarks that we need to think a little bit more carefully about how we measure success in development. And certainly, when people are hungry, you feed them. That's a pretty clear metric of success, and quantitative analysis, et cetera, is central. On the other hand, what would it mean, to your question, to reflect critically on our development practices and how they can often reflect, the code word in the academy is a Western colonialist, neo-imperialist, whatever, kind of a Western template or pattern on what you need. We're the experts. Let's tell you what you need. And sometimes that message is well received because if you're hungry, you don't have time to argue about the particulars. On the other hand, to Silvio's point about how do we measure the effectiveness of integral human development in this broader holistic sense, which I think is very concrete, notwithstanding the philosophical language. We just had a 3-day conference last week here in Rome of the Keough School reflecting on precisely this question. So I will not give you a summary of the 27 papers that said, what difference does IHD make in the fight against poverty, in peacemaking, and so on? I'll mention one that struck me, and this is a little bit counterintuitive, but one of our presenters talked about a critical reflection on development practices would lead us to identify benevolent indignities, is the term he used, by which he meant well-intentioned ways of trying to meet people's needs, or devising more scalable ways of feeding and clothing and delivering clean drinking water to people that are abstracted to some degree from what they think their particular needs are. And he gave specific examples of schemes of agricultural development that made perfect sense quantitatively and were rationally quite good and left the farmer out, oddly, the actual concrete needs of the people they're trying to serve. And so the very best development organizations are already doing some of this, like Catholic Relief Service being one, They're thinking along, in fact, the mission of Catholic Relief Services is to advance integral human development. And so that particular approach tries to avoid benevolent indignities, that is, unintended consequences, when you present certain solutions to problems and you don't see the local picture as well as you might, and in fact it puts people at a disadvantage, or it leaves out the particular needs, in this case of the example he used of farming in parts of Africa, in which the plans and the schemes actually ended up impoverishing farmers in a way they couldn't anticipate. So it's by way of saying this talk about IHD and religious freedom, while it could seem quite abstract, does have specific criteria that can be developed to help us do no harm or avoid a lot of policy work some of the best policy work can be avoiding mistakes as well as advancing constructive decisions. That's important, but part of what we need to do is reflect upon where, with the best of intentions, the policies and the practices that aid and other humanitarian organizations and the church and others, unintended consequences that we can't see because our metrics are too narrow and in a way too narrowly empirical. Sorry for that long answer, Fabio.
No, thank you, Scott. And Silvio, I was struck in your presentation that, of course, we know you for having studied this right for a very long time and also being an advocate of the importance and centrality of this right. But you say in your speech that you are skeptical of the idea on which many also government representatives which are here are working on, and there have been in the last few years, of promoting, exporting, you use exporting religious freedom. And then you said that actually integral human development can help, a better way of thinking how this right can flourish in different contexts. Can you perhaps say something more about that?
Yes. Well, I think that what happened in the last 2-3 decades has shown quite clearly that it's very difficult, I'd say impossible, and maybe also counterproductive. Try to export to court freedom of religion from one country to another. And that is not because freedom of religion is not a universal notion and a universal right. I am convinced that freedom of religion has a universal dimension. But freedom of religion at the same time has grown up, has developed according to different soils, different seeds, different environments. And I wonder whether it is not wiser to start from the seeds that we can find in different human environments in different countries, trying to make them grow, make them flourish into a full-blown freedom of religion, then trying to convince some people that the conception of freedom of religion is better than the one they have, which may be true, but is not, in my opinion, the best strategical option, the best strategic way to make freedom of religion grow in that place. So I think that while freedom of religion is universal, it's something that the wish, the desire to be free in this area is a human characteristic. Everybody has it in his or her soul, heart, etc. We should pay more attention to the tools we employ to make this universal feeling, value, flourish. That is my point.
In this sense, you think that the idea of integral human development point to a possible different approach?
Yes, because it provides a framework for freedom of religion, which is a human dignity. And this framework is, in a way, more allows some more flexibility, allows some more room for accepting different conceptions, different implementation of the idea of human dignity, and therefore of freedom of religion.
Very interesting, very interesting. I'd like now to open the floor and collect a few questions for our speakers. I think there is, okay, I can see one gentleman here. Please introduce yourself, just briefly, your name and affiliation. The gentleman here, yes.
Stuart Stevenson, I'm a former member of the European Parliament until Brexit ended all British membership of the European Parliament. It seems to me, thanks by the way for a very interesting introductory panel, it seems to me that what we need is a common denominator that can resolve the inequalities, the discrimination that we're talking about. I don't believe that we can solve these problems on a national stage. I don't believe that we can single out any specific religion for this purpose. Professor Silvio Ferrari said that freedom of religion is a tool, but it's not an end in itself. So how do we establish the end in itself? Surely we have already hundreds of declarations, we have hundreds of covenants, we're introducing more, we're adding more all the time. That's what we're talking about today. But can we not make an international law? Can we not have a United Nations treaty that bans the political use of religion? It would be indisputable. How could you have a country saying, no, we're not going to sign that treaty? We wish to discriminate. We wish to have a way of discriminating against specific religions. Okay. If we have an organization ban the political use of religion, Be Pure, please come and speak to us. We have international backing for this now. Okay. Please come and speak to us so that we can describe this further.
Thank you for your question. Is there any other question? Yes, the gentleman over there. And then here, yes.
Yes, thank you very much. This is Mahan Mirza. I'm with the Ansari Institute at the University of Notre Dame, and I very much appreciated this opening panel. I want to pick up on what Professor Silvio Ferrari said, that religious freedom is not something that can be exported. But nonetheless, there's a universal aspect to religious freedom, but it must be cultivated in the different soils and different cultures. This very much sounds to me a little bit like what President Khatami of Iran had once promoted as the dialogue of civilizations. And so if that rings true, can you elaborate on how to promote such civilizational dialogue? And if it doesn't ring true, help us understand where the mismatch is. Thank you.
Thank you. There is a question here, the gentleman here.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm Hassan Abdeen, formerly with the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, and working very much in the field in this tension between the practitioners who are actually trying to deliver aid, as Professor Appleby mentioned, those who have immediate needs in international organizations that are actually on the front lines. And then contrasting that with what Professor Silvio mentioned about the inability to export, I think this religious freedom, in its entirety from one country to another. Because I think there needs to be spaces where both sides can have the opportunity to strategize. And I'm sure that that happens in a number of different international fora. But is there a way that we can make this initiative here provide a new impetus or a new platform where which some of these discussions can take place, where you can have the philosophical and the intellectual and academic skills and tools brought to and presented to practitioners who are in the field. I was struck by Professor Appleby's comments that, Professor Lebre, who's inspired IHC, the founder of the notion, actually produced his work after traveling through many countries like Senegal, Lebanon, multicultural, multi-faith societies in which these ideas of freedom of religion and of tolerance and equality have organically developed locally. And when you have that organic local context, there are a lot of seeds, as Professor Silvio mentioned, that maybe we could be using. So where are the seeds that we could mobilize and activate and feed and water in other countries? I mean, when it doesn't work, let's say in Central African Republic, we see the chaos that enshrines or ensues from that. So I was inspired, but also really challenged to say, let's try to use this opportunity to take this forward in a positive direction. So thank you.
Thank you. Is there maybe, I'll take one more, two, if there are any questions, and then, yes, the gentleman over there, and then Sharon over there, yes.
Thank you. Andreas Tonhauser, EWTN, thank you very much for your outlines. It was very interesting. I just wonder, engaging also with international institutions, with the international community, is there still a, let's say, fear of religion that you would encounter speaking about all of this? Thank you.
Thank you. And then Sharon Rosen, there.
Excuse me, Fabio, we didn't quite get that question.
Okay, can you please repeat the question because they didn't get it, sorry.
I'm sorry, engaging with international institutions, with the international community, do you still see or feel that there might be a fear of religion still present?
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Sharon Rosen from Search for Common Ground, the largest peace-building organization in the world that is very much implementing this work. I'm wondering if this is an issue of nomenclature, of actually how we call what we are doing in the field, with the recognition that where we are, in many cases, we cannot even use the term religious freedom or freedom of religion or belief, and we try to take the context into account in order to match it with the needs of the countries concerned. But I think one of the main problems is that in many places where we work, religious freedom is not there. And what do we do when we try and take the context into account, but actually cannot advance religious freedom in those places, or integral human development, as we call it?
Thank you very much. Some excellent discussion. I'll give back. Scott, do you want to react to anything you think might?
Of course. Sure. Just 5 points. Number one, chaos will always reign. This is what I mean by this. I'm really quite realistic. I think any such efforts to bolster the notion of religious freedom, of integral human development, we have to recognize this is, when you mentioned the Central African Republic, it called this to mind. I don't think anyone is naive enough in this room or beyond to think that whatever efforts we make are going to resolve crises and both epistemological, social, and political across the board. What we're hoping for is incremental progress that builds over time So just to state the obvious, because it can sometimes sound like this is the panacea or this is the solution. Rather, the argument is more modest, I think, that how can we advance and improve the situation on the ground. Secondly, to Fabio's earlier question to me about what difference does IHD make, I could have gone through some specific cases. I'll simply say this. In the conference and when we asked that question, it's to the local. The difference that IHD makes is that the prioritization of the local, and this is to Sharon's point and others, that there's a certain discernment in the local, a kind of accompaniment that we import from peace building into integral human development. It's all part of that kind of continuum of practice in which you're accompanying and you are learning from and engaging with specific needs. So we have a peace accords matrix that implements the peace accords in Colombia, complicated on the state and national, international level. And our success has been, and I will call this an IHD lens, has been when our folks down there, our colleagues, deal with particular communities who have very specific historical grievances, needs, ethnic, religious, and so on, and the conversation in itself, in evoking those sensibilities, is a resonance with human dignity. It's kind of the enactment of human dignity because you're presuming that the people you're working with actually don't have technocratic solutions, but they have insights that help guide those solutions. Again, we could give some specific examples. Third point is on the question, again, Sharon and others mentioned this, the notion of human dignity or of religious freedom, from culture to culture, it's absent. We had a very, for me, illuminating set of studies that we haven't completed at Notre Dame and beyond with other colleagues, studying comparatively across religious traditions, just the notion of human dignity. What is the salience of this notion? What are its connotations in Islam? And of course, there's no such thing as Islam, so we ask within particular Islamic communities, no such thing as Christianity in the abstract. So and of course, that's a big study, but there's a sampling enough to recognize that the very notion of what human dignity means and how it's understood really varies dramatically, and even the term itself or some cognate is not always available in the discourse and the vocabulary of the people we're working with. So as educators, one of the things I think we have to continue to do, and this is to your first question, what's the one thing, the common ground you ask for? This sounds too simple, but I think it's the case, and that is to continue to press and press and press upon a kind of a growing consensus about the dignity of each and every person. What does that entail? Well, it entails a kind of an orientation toward nonviolence, toward not violating the sanctity of human life and so on. There's certain things that we would think we could build a growing consensus around the simple idea, quote unquote, ironically, of what it means to say humans have something called dignity, and what does that entail, and how do you put yourself outside the pale of that human consensus? This is not new. Again, we're speaking incrementally. It's not that this is a new idea, but I think the consistent effort to work on the cross-culturally on what do we mean collectively and how can we advance them? What does human dignity require? Can we get an acknowledgement from certain societies that yes, the person has a dignity, and that in itself will be a challenge in some societies. Even the acknowledgement of a concept like human dignity of the individual as opposed to the collective. So we know these things. They're major hurdles. Finally, on the international organizations, the fear of religion. Yeah, a little bit of fear of religion, more disgust with religion among some of the culture despisers of religion, some of whom are in international organizations. And I have to say, I didn't include this in my comments, but it's part of, it'd be worth reading Clement Sedmak's book, Enacting Integral Human Development, which is quite good. I send you the link. And one of the things he acknowledges, he's a big proponent of IHD, of integral human development, as am I, but you have to acknowledge the various weaknesses, inherent weaknesses, anytime a Catholic, or perhaps I won't speak for other traditions, I'm Catholic, When you stand up and start preaching to folks, the first thing they will say is, why don't you get your gender act in order? Or what about the sexual abuse crisis? You know, who are you? In this, Archbishop Gallagher referred to very elegantly, I forget the exact term, the kind of complete displacement of religion from the center of cultural and social life, which is a dramatic development in our lifetime. And part of it is, especially on younger generations, is fueled by the perception that religion, among other religions, will call for these aspirational goals and fail, or their goals are not commensurate with what people on the ground say, this is my human dignity to have reproductive rights. Counter that. Let's talk about the dignity and what it entails. So it's not so much fear, it's a kind of suspicion or a lack of respect, not because of the claims that are made, in my view, which people can kind of, on a certain level, agree with the moral claims, but that we're not always the best witnesses to living those claims. I'm not speaking one in particular, but precisely when you have religion or moral philosophical speakers who say, look, I'm speaking on a moral ground, I'm speaking about religion, I'm speaking about ideals, then you're putting a bullseye on your back unless your house is in order. And so we have to acknowledge there is that suspicion, less so much fear, I think, these days, a little disdain, and that has to be engaged honestly as well.
Thank you, Scott. Silvio, do you want to?
Yes, many questions. I'll pick up a couple. The first one, if freedom is not the end, and the end is human dignity, how can we define human dignity? What is human dignity? That was more or less, as I understood, the first question. I'll make an example. Speaking of human dignity of religious minorities, if we start from the perspective of religious minorities, freedom is necessary, absolutely. But freedom is not enough. Because for a member of a religious minority, living with dignity is also a matter of recognition, not only of freedom, but of recognition that you, in your diversity, can provide a contribution to the building of the common good. And this is different from freedom. It's something more. And this is closer to human dignity than to freedom. And this is the only way to make religious minorities an asset for the whole society. Recognizing that their contribution can be part of a more broad, a more general development. The other point, civilization dialogue, that kind of thing. Monsignor Gallagher, speaking of freedom of religion, said, well, there is an individual, collective, and institutional side of freedom of religion. And that is clear. But these three components of freedom of religion did not develop in the same way everywhere. In some countries, in some regions of the world, or in some religions, the institutional side of I'm thinking of the Catholic religion, for example. The institutional side of freedom is central. Is not. I'm not saying that the individual and collective are not there, but the institutional profile is central. In some other religions, the institutional profile of freedom of religion is not so central. I'm thinking of Islam, for example. In some regions of the world, the individual profile of freedom of religion is central, here in Europe, for example. I think that in India, and I look my friend Rajiv, the collective profile has a stronger impact. And I'm not saying that the individual profile is better than the collective one or vice versa. They need to be integrated, but this interplay between individual, collective, institutional allows some flexibility, some openness to different implementation of the right of religious freedom without detracting anything from its universality. That is the point I would like to stress.
Thank you very much. Archbishop.
Thank you. I think I've just got three very quick thoughts to end on. I think the task before all of us is creating conditions, creating an environment in which religious freedom can develop and grow. Also, I agree very much in a local context. I think that's very important. And in that sense, I think my other point that I would make is that ignorance is, I think, one of the great enemies of religious freedom, because we fear and resent what we don't understand. And that is very characteristic of religious communities, which, for many good reasons, often tend to isolate themselves in the form of a cultural ghetto. And I think that doesn't help us either in a developmental way or in a religious way. The final one is just to react to the question. I would agree that in maybe certain organizational levels, there is a degree of fear and suspicion of religion. But I think we do have to recognize, and I think I did mention it in my speech earlier, that in a lot of state structures, governmental structures and institutions, religion still is looked on as in a negative light. It's more part of the problem than the solution. And religion is something to be managed in some way. And I think that's a challenge to all of us, particularly in the democratic world today, because understandably our institutions want to work for the common good, and sometimes in that consideration, religion sometimes doesn't come out very well. So I think we've got to work on that and try and correct that perspective. If maybe our political leaders were more to see the religion of the people that they're representing or they're governing in a positive light, I think that would make a significant contribution. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Archbishop. I think we are for a great start. Please join me in thanking our panelists for